Welcome to the next episode of Called to the Bar, International Law Over Drinks, a series of informal conversations about current issues in international law, life in academia, and whatever else is on our mind. In these conversations, we are speaking off the cuff and without the benefit of footnotes, and nothing we say should be taken to have been thoroughly peer-reviewed. I'm Dr. Tamsin Phillipa Paige, Associate Professor at Deakin Law School, and I'm joined today by Dr. Sarah McCosker, Partner at Lexbridge Lawyers, CJ McKenzie, Senior Legal Officer with the Office of International Law in the Australian AG's Department, and Associate Professor Dave Letts of the Australian National Centre for Oceans Resources and Security at the University of Wollongong, and formerly a Commodore in the Royal Australian Navy. It must be noted at this stage that all of our guests are here in their personal capacity, and nothing they say should be attributed to their employers or clients, past or present. Today, we are discussing what the practice of international law looks like at a day-to-day level. So before we get down to the main focus of the episode, the first question for everyone.
This afternoon, it's water.
CJ?
I have a yuzu soda, which is a strange love, which I really enjoy. For those who might not be familiar, I find some people aren't. Yuzu is a Japanese citrus fruit, which I quite enjoy, somewhere between a lemon and a grapefruit and a mandarin, which is a great place to sit, I think. And I'm generally a non-alcoholic beverage type person, so I really like these.
Well, for me this afternoon, I'm drinking a cup of tea, which is a spiced chai to be exact, but my day is not complete without many cups of tea. I usually begin with English breakfast or Earl Grey and then graduate through to chai and peppermint tea during the day. But I am looking forward, as it's nearing the end of the week, to a possible gin and tonic later today or tomorrow.
Sounds good. And as our listeners will know, I am usually the resident tea drinker, but today I have sparkling mineral water mixed with cloudy apple juice because it's a little bit warm and I didn't have any iced tea made ahead of time. So that's the important part of the episode out of the way. But a fine tradition when people first appear here on the podcast is we discuss how we got to know each other. Now, Sarah, I first encountered you at my first ever ANZL in 2013 when you were still working with the Australian government, but I'm not sure if we met then or not. Beyond that, I know that we know each other from the ANZL space for the most part. Do you want to talk it through from your perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Tamsin. I was thinking about this, and I think I must have met you a bit earlier than that, because I do remember meeting you at the ANU at some point during the time I was working for the Attorney General's Department, which was between 2006 and 2013. And I remember hearing you present on some of your research at the ANU, perhaps under the supervision of Rob McLaughlin. But yes, that's absolutely right, that since then we've caught up through a variety of ANZL activities.
Now, CJ, I'm pretty certain we met through Twitter, but it might have been ANZL. Do you want to correct me on this one?
It might have been Twitter, because we were both at ANZL, tweeting about ANZL. I actually went back and had a look today, but found that I suspect you're no longer on that platform, Tamsin, and I took the opportunity actually to deactivate my handle today, which had been sitting dormant a little bit. But I think we had some interesting conversations, and we've done also a little bit of collaboration around comments on research proposals, because we have such different areas of practice.
Yeah, I have definitely deactivated my account. I figured this was not that was not a space I wanted to keep my name on. And Dave, I'm not certain exactly when we met, but I know it was through our shared connection at the ANU and our work with Rob McLaughlin. Although we now both also play golf at the same course. So what do you remember of us meeting?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was after I got to ANU, Tamsin, at the end of 2012 or early 2013, when I stopped working full-time in the Navy. And I should say too, I still am a Commodore, not formally a Commodore. I do an occasional bit of work for Defence.
My apologies.
That's all right. And I'm also, as well as my ANCORS role, I'm also still working at ANU every now and then as well. So my international law work continues at both of those academic institutions. But you and I, late 2012 or early 2013, when you were just finishing off your, what was it, MPhil?
Was my MPhil on piracy with Rob with Rob McLaughlin when he was the head of counter-piracy for the UNODC.
Yeah, so I think that's the time, and as you say, we've see each other reasonably regularly around the golf course as well, trying to take out our frustrations and share our inadequacies of various types in terms of hitting golf balls.
Yeah, fantastic. So now, given that this entire episode is about what a career in international legal practice, could you all perhaps say something about how you got into international law and what your career path has looked like that brought you to your current roles and would anyone in particular like to start? I'm going to volunteer someone if you don't want.
I can.
Go for it, Dave.
Perhaps because I studied international law initially, the longest time ago. My first exposure to international law was in the 1980s when I was studying then. And my Navy career, unsurprisingly, took me all over the world, various places, and I got to see some of the things that were happening around the world. And so that when I finished my seagoing time in the mid-90s, I went to ANU and studied a Masters of International Law at that time, and started working full time in the Defence Department's international law area. So I think it was just a natural extension of life as a military lawyer, having been at sea quite a number of years over the 80s and 90s, and where the legal path was likely to take me when working in defence.
Now, just a quick follow-up to that. Did your time at sea as a military lawyer involve much international law?
That was later on. So my initial time at sea was working as a supply officer or logistics officer, just one of the, I suppose in those days we didn't have many lawyers at sea at all, even when operations were underway. And in fact, in those times too, we didn't have that many operations, certainly not what we saw in the 90s and 2000s and for the last really three decades. So no, that initial time was not providing legal advice, but later on certainly had the time on exercise and operations, as many defence lawyers have over the last few decades.
Fantastic. I'm going to kick it to you, CJ. Do you want to talk about your career?
Thanks, Tamsin. So I was thinking about my path to practicing international law when I was thinking about our discussion today, and I started making some notes about what I did at university and what jobs I got after university and what prepared me for those jobs. But then in a turn that I hope reflects how I think about advising clients, I was thinking that it would probably be very useful for listeners, especially those who might want to know how they can pave their path into international law, as opposed to what my path looked like. I wanted to talk a little bit about barriers, because I started thinking about the things. There's the inevitable hard work. You've got to do all the study and apply for more jobs than you can count, particularly if you go down the kind of traditional clerkship type route and you feel like you're drowning in applications. But it can be pretty daunting. And I realized that one of the things that challenged me was the challenges around mental health and disability, and then also about how those barriers intersect with other things that work differently for people. So working in economic or security law as a woman, those are still the most heavily kind of male dominated areas of law. And I can see Sarah nodding, particularly in the economic space. Working as an LGBT person with many different state actors and countries and regional organisations can be a different experience as well. So I just wanted to make that point for those who are looking at their forward path into international law. And the second point is that when you're making that plan of how to get along the path, different barriers will crop up that you won't expect. And like all good operational units in the world, you need to be able to roll with it a bit and build a new plan or a detour. Or indeed, the other thing that crops up is opportunities that you don't expect, and you've got to be able to roll with those too. So that was just some of my background thinking in when I was thinking about your question. So I'm currently at the Office of International Law, but when I finished high school, I was really interested in poverty reduction and conflict. And I was looking around for a degree that could teach me about why, in a political sense, these were things that persisted, and I wanted to know why they happened. And I found a degree that really suited me at the University of Edinburgh. And I think in hindsight, choosing an institution that had the academic and research focus that I was really interested in was something that made a really big difference to me. So I read a joint master's in international law and international relations with a heavy focus on international law. And then I came home and worked variously in the Department of Defence at the Australian Civil Military Centre, which has a focus on protection of civilians, lessons learned practices, women, peace and security, and some of those really interesting operational issues. And then I moved through a couple of roles at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, briefly into the private sector and working on investment treaty implementation, and then landed at the Office of International Law, where I live now.
Fantastic. That's a really rich journey through different institutions. And Sarah, do you want to tell us about your path?
Thanks, Tamsin, and so interesting to hear, Dave and CJ, about your pathways as well. And I really couldn't agree more with your remarks, CJ, about the fact that there are multiple pathways to international law and multiple drivers and lots of unexpected opportunities that end up having really formative influences. I mean, for me, I never set out deliberately to be an international lawyer. For me, I would say, though, that a key driver that pointed me in that direction was that I always wanted to do work with an international dimension. I grew up as a third culture kid, as the daughter of a diplomat, moving very frequently throughout my childhood and early adulthood between different countries and cultures. I was actually born in Mexico, so I'm a dual Australian-Mexican citizen, a little known fact about me. But that experience gave me the privilege of being exposed to a lot of different cultures and led to circumstances where I often feel most at home when I'm operating at the sort of interface of multiple communities and identities, rather than wanting to be squarely situated in one or the other. And so I had a kind of a natural leaning towards a career in diplomacy and languages. But then when I did an arts law degree at the University of Queensland, I loved all my art subjects, but the main subject that fascinated me in law was international law. And I found doing the Jessup Moot a really formative experience. And then that led, after that, to serving as an associate at the Supreme Court of Queensland, and then being admitted to the bar. And then I moved to the UK to do some postgraduate studies to really further that love of international law. I went over for a one-year master's, and it turned into some additional degrees and eventually my doctorate, which I wrote on the relationships between law and diplomacy and dispute settlement, still, as you can see, being a bit undecided on whether I should pursue law or diplomacy. And my supervisor of my doctorate, Sir Frank Berman, QC, who played a really crucial role in encouraging me to return to Australia to work as a legal advisor for government, because he too had been a legal advisor for the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office. So he said to me, well, Sarah, if you're writing on the relationships between law and diplomacy, you better go and develop some practice in it. So in short compass, I returned to Australia. I worked in the Office of International Law for many years, and then worked in the ICRC in Geneva as a legal advisor. After that, I and several colleagues set up Lexbridge, which is a public international law firm and consultancy. And since returning to Australia, I've been practicing in Lexbridge for I think it's 10 years this year, and working on predominantly defence and security negotiation issues and a range of things for government and non-government clients.
Fantastic. Well, as I said, it's all got very, very different paths. So we're going to move on to the question of what these varied paths to international law and how they look on an average day in practice, because I've no doubt it's very different to my life in academia. So each, do you want to tell me what does it look like practicing as a government lawyer, CJ? And Sarah, what does it look like practicing international law in a private practice sense? And Dave, what does military law look like at a day-to-day practice level?
So interestingly, I've just started a new practice area. I've moved out of the practice that I was doing for the last few years into a new space that I've done some academic research on before, but haven't worked in. So my practice at the moment looks like a lot of reading and research to get myself back up to date with the current practice in this space, which means that I'm back reading a lot of foreign legislation, academic commentary, and meeting with new stakeholders across the now that I'm back in the defence and security space after many years. So catching up on where all of that has landed, which I've been reflecting is a little bit like doing a research paper, except that you don't actually know what the questions are going to be yet.
Dave, what does military law day-to-day practice look like?
A couple of different aspects, Tamsin. One is something that CJ and Sarah would be very familiar with, which is providing advice, particularly when you're working in the Canberra environment, in the office of, what's it called now? Security and International Law, whatever the current name is.
Directorate of Operations in International Law, Doyle.
Oh, it's gone back to Doyle.
I'm back to Doyle. Yeah.
Okay, all right. I can't keep up with the acronyms, but so that sort of work is what listeners who work in government practice would be very familiar with, where they're being presented with a legal problem. They have to draft some advice. That advice then gets talked about, cleared. Eventually, it'll get to whomever is looking for the advice and fed into the bureaucratic machine, perhaps working with the Office of International Law, Foreign Affairs and Trade, which is more often the case than not, so that the government advice on a particular legal issue can be provided. The other part of being a military lawyer in particular is when you're deployed and you're not working in that environment and you're working for your commander. Your commander might be service specific. So in my case as a Navy lawyer, I might be working for a naval officer who's in charge of a task force. But it also might be the case, and it was my experience, where you're working for an officer from a different service or even a different country as part of a coalition or as part of a UN peacekeeping operation as their lawyer. And in that case, you're really concentrating on tactical advice, day-to-day advice, depending upon what the particular operation is. It could be through that range, from peacekeeping operations through to war fighting, as Australia has experienced certainly in the last 25 years and more. So that's a pretty dynamic type of activity that the lawyer's involved in. There's probably, well, it depends at what level you go as well, whether you're the lawyer in charge or whether you're one of a number of lawyers supporting whoever is the lawyer in charge. So when you're deployed on operations, they can be very long hours. You may not have access to the level of legal support that you would hope to have access to. And you've also got to do your legal research as best you can, but you've also got to be able to provide relevant, useful legal information to your commander, which sometimes might cause a little bit of disagreement amongst other members of the staff about what the appropriate action might be in a given circumstance. So whole range, Tamsin, depending upon what the environment is. And as I said, just because you're a lawyer of one of Australia's 3 services doesn't mean that you will always be providing advice on that particular domain, be it maritime, land or air. You may very much be part of a joint activity that is taking place, and so your wide range and knowledge of international law will be very important.
Fantastic. And for listeners who are finding themselves or are interested in this space, Rob McLaughlin wrote a fantastic article in 2010 called Giving Operational Legal Advice that we'll put the link in the show notes. It's well worth having a read of. in that article as well that expands on what Dave's just spoken about here. And Sarah, do you want to talk to us about what your day-to-day looks like?
Thanks, Tamsin. Well, what I can say is that my days usually begin very early. I'm usually up at around 5, and I use that time from about 5 a.m. to 7 a.m. as a precious window of time, which is where my household is quiet. There are no children or puppies. It's just quiet, and I can endeavour to get a grip on my inbox and attend to some of the business administration of running Lexbridge as a law firm. And part of the reason I need to do that at that sort of time of day is, number one, to start the day feeling a bit in control, but also because during office hours, usually I'm supporting the work of clients, and like as Dave said, that really what my day-to-day work will look like very much depends on the work that I'm doing at the time, and for whom. But sometimes I'm working on site in my client offices, and a very significant proportion of my work involves working as an embedded lawyer on secondment, essentially embedded within particular teams in a few government departments. So I have an office and a desk there, and I go in, and to all intents and purposes, I'm part of that team. And a lot of my work is quite high tempo and reactive. Some of it is much longer, more patient, steady work over long periods of time. But a significant proportion of my day is spent servicing client needs, and that may be anything from advice writing or reviewing various ministerial submissions, providing legal input to policy documents, treaty negotiation and negotiation of less than treaty status instruments is a big part of my work. Also, quite a lot of my work is about supporting legislative reform, and some of that work we are doing in a capacity building way with a number of countries across the Pacific. So that's really work that's quite different to some of my other work. That's working alongside peers to support them in their policy development and provide legal support as they do that. So my daily work really differs depending on whether I'm working for a client or whether I'm working in my home office. I really enjoy the days when I don't have as many high tempo tasks, and I can attend to some of the quieter pieces of thinking. They don't all come all that often, I must say. But probably the last thing I would say is a pretty common feature of my work is that in addition to my paid client work, usually there's a portion of every day that is devoted to, I guess, what I would describe as extracurricular or pro bono international law activities. And that's really about engaging in wider promotion of international law in the community through things like training, capacity building. I have a number of volunteer roles. Both Dave and I serve in volunteer capacities for the Australian Red Cross, promoting international humanitarian law dissemination and understanding. So when I sit back and look at my average day or my average week, actually probably quite a lot of my days would involve sometimes speaking at a community event or delivering training or supporting some of those activities in various ways. But yeah, so it really depends.
Or appearing on a podcast.
Yes.
Okay, so what are the highlights or favourite parts for each of you of practicing in international law? And I'm going to throw it to Dave first, just to change the order around.
Look, I think in my case, it's changed over time. Certainly, deployments, I've had a number of deployments to operational areas, and at the time, they were very rewarding opportunities. They were different opportunities. They were new types of things that I was doing. So I was in East Timor in 2002 through the UN administration, through independence, and then new state of Timor-Leste as the chief lawyer for the peacekeeping force. That was a very interesting time, and I'll talk a bit about that in relation to one of your later questions. But also, not long after that, when I thought I was going to have a nice period of time at home out at Western Creek, just out here in Canberra, have a 3-year posting, engaged in some of the things that Sarah was interested in, some of the diplomacy type and foreign international relations issues for 3 years. I lasted not very long at all out there before I found myself in Baghdad. Completely different scenario then. And then after I moved into academia, in terms of the practice of international law, it's like yours. It's more focused on writings. It's more focused on meeting and collaborating with people, as well as the stuff that Sarah talked about in terms of committee and other pro bono and volunteer work, which is part and parcel of the practice as well. I've been very lucky in the sense that I've had the opportunity to meet a lot of wonderful colleagues here in Australia and around the world who practice in international law. Sarah mentioned Sir Frank Berman. I got to see him in The Hague in 1999, appearing before the ICJ with Britain as the Kosovo campaign was being taken apart by the ICJ. And I've had a number of wonderful opportunities like that over the course of the years. So it's it's one of those things that changes as your career expands and develops, I suppose. Sarah and CJ have both said about no particular day looking the same. So that can happen throughout your international law journey, even though sometimes it might not feel like that's the case when you can get bogged down in some particularly heavy advice that you have to prepare.
Fantastic, thank you. Sarah or CJ, who'd like to go next?
Sure. I think my favorite part of practice is really the people and the clients that I work with. One of my favorite things that happens to me occasionally is where I see a client or a colleague after an intervening period, and they give me an update on the project that we were working on together, or the outcome that came out, which is perhaps better than expected. I had this really pleasingly happen a couple of years ago when I actually ended up collaborating for a brief period with Lexbridge on some processes in the Pacific, and returning to that work after a little while, having one of my counterparts from a Pacific Island country come and let me know that the work that we had done had supported them to access further UN support and funding for their legislative reform that was then in train and was going to make a big impact in the goals that we were working towards. And so those little catch-ups after you've stepped away from something that show the difference that you can make, and also how we all influence each other and end up working in a kind of broader cosmology, if you like, of the practice, are definitely some of my favourite moments.
Thanks so much. Sarah, what about your favourite moments?
There are so many, but I would say some of my favourite parts are probably international negotiations, whether they be bilateral or multilateral. I've had opportunities to participate in some quite complex negotiations that have taken place over many years, and then others that are kind of more intensive. But I've always enjoyed learning from those experiences, and I find it very rewarding and satisfying when one can bring to bear all your skill sets of diplomacy, of law, but of just trying to find practical solutions for the clients, and then finally managing to help the client get something over the line and actually concluded. I think in a lot of our international law work, you can feel like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and actually reaching conclusions and outcomes can be quite hard won. So it's always a satisfying thing when one can help deliver a pragmatic solution for a client and get something concluded. I suppose the other thing I particularly enjoy is trying to where I can build bridges and connections between different international law communities of practice. And when I reflect on it, I think actually a lot of my career has been spent on trying to build linkages across academia or across government or the private sector and civil society. And in fact, when I look back at that, really was part of the thinking behind the selection of Lexbridge as our firm's name, about law as a bridge builder. But one of the things that I've really found rewarding over recent years is where, in order to help achieve a particular outcome, I put together a multidisciplinary team of people. So, for example, some of the work we're doing in the Pacific, we have in the realm of anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism, we have legal experts, but we also have some former AFP, like police prosecutors, and then legislative drafters. So I find that exciting, where we can bring in multidisciplinary perspectives. And I also would say I agree very much with you, CJ, about how lovely it is and how energizing it is to feel part of the broader community of international lawyers. I mean, there's that, the concept of the invisible College of International Lawyers, but now, of course, it's not so invisible. There are so many of us, but that sense of feeling a connection as part of a professional community that transcends geography, and that when you go to a conference, you encounter people who are working on similar issues from very different backgrounds. And so that sense of connection and common passion, I think, is a real very important piece of what I love about international law practice.
Fantastic, thank you. And I'm going to stick with you to get you to lead off the next question. So our next question is, what parts of international legal practice do you struggle with or find difficult?
I would say probably the thing I find most difficult is that, because the majority of my work is necessarily reactive to meeting client requests and needs, it can be really challenging to carve out time for quieter thinking and long-term projects. And I suppose there are a couple of aspects of this. I mean, one is that there are many areas of international law that I'm interested in and I'd love to be able to investigate and pursue in more depth. But I feel quite constrained by lack of time. So I have a long reading list, and which I don't seem to plow my way through as much as I'd like. But secondly, and related to this, is having a series of good ideas for international law projects or initiatives, and not necessarily having the time or resources to take those forward as quickly as I would like. But I think these are common challenges for not just international lawyers, but probably all lawyers, just wanting to find more bandwidth, while also, of course, ensuring that there's enough time for rest and rejuvenation and life outside of work.
Yeah, I'd agree with all of that. Even from an academic perspective, I have more projects that I want to do than I have time to do them. So yeah, I would agree with that as well. CJ, what about you? What do you find difficult or a struggle?
One of the things that I think about a lot, in that I have almost exclusively worked for sovereign clients, and of course there are private clients in international law, particularly in the economic space, but also in other spaces. One of the things that I think about a lot is the nebulousness of the sovereign client in international law, and how to conceptualize the interests of the client, because of course you'll always have an instructing official or an instructing agency which has a particular perspective and particular instructions. But I think perhaps it says something that I started my life in an area of the Australian government that focuses very much on interagency relationships and that whole of government perspective. And I think working with lots of different sovereign states, I often find myself wondering about the interests of the client that I can't see because I'm limited by the particular project that I'm working on, or the perspective of the people that I'm speaking to. So perhaps that's a little bit esoteric, but that is something that I think about a lot, and particularly when working on things like litigation or really sensitive issues, thinking about what the interest of your client is and who that client is something that I would say wrestle with often.
Yeah, I hadn't even considered that, but that makes perfect sense, and I really appreciate that insight. Dave, what about you?
I suppose thinking about difficulties that I find, maybe not personal difficulties in terms of my output, but I do struggle with what I see as violations of international law broadly at a strategic level across a number of different areas that I research, study and teach in, that seem to go without resolution. So, and the areas that I'm thinking about are things like the law in relation to conflict, and also law of the sea and maritime security more broadly. Just not all of them, not all of the issues involved aren't resolved, but there are many that are seen where states, not even states that are necessarily great and powerful states as people might think about them, but just where states tend to disregard what might be thought to be norms of international law, and the consequence of that disregard seems difficult to resolve. So I suppose that's something in terms of an effective enforcement mechanism for international law that's widely accepted, believed in, and understood. That's a frustration, perhaps, that maybe some others here present today have also experienced from time to time.
I know, having spent, as I said, a good portion of my research career in maritime and security law and IHL, I know those frustrations well. So yeah, I think that's a universal one of other lawyers. And CJ, did you want to chime in with some extra bits?
Yeah, I'm really interested in that observation, David, because I think we're pulling on similar threads around the difference between, of course, the short-term interest and the long-term interest, and how, again, the state, whoever that happens to be, approaches that interest, and how the individuals that make up that state will make different decisions depending on what their horizon is, what institution they come from, and all of those things. And I think that can lead to some of those types of circumstances that you've described. So I think the relationship there is quite interesting.
Did you want to chime in with anything additional to that observation from Dave, Sarah, or should we move on?
Well, I think probably just to say, I think your observations, Dave and CJ, really resonate with, I guess, this challenge that a lot of international lawyers are facing at the moment, which is it's quite a dispiriting time to be an international lawyer. And all of us are pragmatic and not Pollyanna-ish about these things, but finding that balance between acknowledging the reality of the fact that there are many states that have a strong disregard for international law, but also and trying to find ways of dealing with that, while also trying to remain quite positive and resilient. So I just think that's probably a common thread, I imagine, of some either recent or upcoming podcasts, Tamsin, the challenging times that international lawyers are operating in, and just how important it is for us to keep speaking about these things and promoting compliance.
Yeah, I would agree. So let's move on to something a little bit more uplifting. Do any of you have any moments that you can and would like to share that serve as a highlight or funny anecdote from your international law careers? And I'm going to look, Dave, you've already said you have one, so I'm going to throw it to you first.
Well, I might have said I had a highlight, but whether it's funny or not is another matter.
It doesn't have to be funny, but it definitely, a highlight story is very welcome here.
Well, I think highlight, a couple of highlights were certainly those deployments that I had to both Timor and Iraq at relevant times. and also living through events that have happened subsequently. So in Timor's case, of course, one of the things that emerged out of the independence of Timor-Leste was Australia's role in trying to get certain concessions out of Timor in relation to maritime zones and resources, which eventually ended up in the conciliation that occurred a couple of years ago between Australia and Timor-Leste. But being there in Timor in 2002 and working with the UN as advisors on the civil side, we're trying to advise Timor about what they should and shouldn't do, and staying sort of a little bit away from that advice, because that wasn't my role as part of the peacekeeping force, but certainly being aware that it was on foot was interesting. The independence itself in Timor, the fact that gone from 2.5 years of UN administration to a new state, that was a fascinating period. And for different reasons, a couple of years later in 2004, when I was in Baghdad, that was equally fascinating. And again, subsequently, questions about the legitimacy of whether forces should have gone there a year earlier, about the unrest that emerged over the period that I was there, amongst various elements, and the sort of advice that we were dealing with there was very much operationally focused and involved the delivery of kinetic effects, which is code for saying that people were getting killed and targets were getting destroyed. Quite a different scenario from when I was in Timor. But the commander of the Australians who was there at the time, he had been the boss out at Western Creek when I was there, and I said that my time there was cut rather short. Once we knew he was going, and he was going as the chief of operations, working with the Americans, I was quite happy to wish him very well and hope that he had a wonderful time over there, and let him know that I didn't plan to see him. Probably about a month and a half after that conversation, he and I were together in his car driving through the streets of Baghdad, dressed up in strange equipment that army people in particular tend to wear to make sure that we were as protected as best we could. His special forces people who were in the car let me know that if something happened, just try my best. Their job was to look after the general, not me. And fortunately, nothing did happen on that trip, and we got to where we needed to go. But yeah, it's a range of different things, Tamsin, that we could talk about for, I'm sure the 3-4 of us could talk about our experiences for a while, but you never really know what's around the corner.
Yeah.
In practice.
Yeah, that's definitely some experiences there, and I can imagine it would have been quite surreal to be going through in the moment. CJ or Sarah, who would like to go next?
I'll share another sort of slightly surreal scenario that I had encountered, but not nearly as life-threatening and dangerous as Dave's. I would say probably at the outset that the majority of highlights and funny stories in my career are ones that I precluded about from speaking about because of confidentiality and security strains. But this is, of course, the lot of an international lawyer, and that often our most interesting work is really just done quietly behind the scenes. But one thing I would highlight is the work that I did to help a client government department finalize a major treaty that had been under negotiation for almost a decade. And there had been many, many negotiating rounds, and we had been sent over right in the early days of the COVID pandemic to another country for an indefinite period until we reached certain outcomes. So for this negotiations, it was like a case study that you could imagine, lock two negotiating teams in a hotel. All we could do was either be in our hotel room or in the negotiating room, and we couldn't leave because of quarantine requirements. So that was a very unique and intensive experience, and hopefully one never to be repeated. But we got there in the end. So that was a really unusual negotiating experience. I guess two other quick things that I'd mention as highlights from recent years are I was really privileged to have the opportunity to do some work for the Disability Royal Commission over the course of about a year and a half, providing legal support to the Commission. It was my first experience of supporting a Royal Commission. And so that was a really terrific experience for me. And then the third thing I'd mention would be my experience in supporting DFAT in leading Australia's first campaign for the election of Hilary Charlesworth, now Judge Charlesworth, for the International Court of Justice. So I was delighted when DFAT had asked if I could assist with that body of work. Of course, it brought together my twin interests in law and diplomacy, and it was a really great honour and privilege to play a role in supporting Charlesworth to become an ICJ judge, particularly somebody who's been an international law role model for me and so many others over many years. So those are just three things I'd mention.
Yeah, and as regular listeners to the podcast will know, we consider Judge Hilary Charlesworth to be a saint within the podcasting crew. Blessed be her name. And after your story of that negotiation, Sarah, I will never complain about Melbourne lockdowns again. So, CJ, what about some highlights from you?
So I will come with perhaps a funny story from when I was brand new to the public service. And one of the real joys about working as a civilian, particularly among military officers, is that you're the only person in the room not wearing a uniform. And sometimes that can be a bit terrifying to those in uniform, because there is no way to immediately tell where in the chain of command or the hierarchy that you sit. So one of my very early funny experiences was when I was a very junior public servant, and I went down to the Defence College at Western Creek and walked into an officers training course that hosted a number of partners from other military forces around the world. And I had about 8 majors, 1-stars rush to offer me a cup of tea and a seat because they just weren't 100% sure how they should treat the person who wasn't in uniform. And for those who speak Australian public service, I was an APS 5 at the time. And I always found that ambiguity of being the civilian that nobody knows how to treat a little bit funny, and it often turns up in funny ways. Although I have to say, it can be even more amusing among a bunch of privates and fresh recruits who really don't know what to do with you at that point, whereas senior officers tend to just err on the side of caution, which can be a real delight, but a little bit amusing when you're the most junior person in the room. And I think, like Sarah and David, and a little bit like Sarah, it is the lot of an international lawyer for many things to happen quietly in the background. And I've had so many experiences that I feel extremely privileged to have been a part of. One of my kind of career highlights is, I think I mentioned briefly earlier, working on the implementation of the Treaty in the Pacific, the PACER Plus implementation project. It's the Pacific Agreement on Closer Economic Relations. And the reason that I really highlight that experience for me is twofold. One is that for many of the parties to that agreement, it was their first ever investment agreement, which is a really significant milestone and a really significant legal framework to connect smaller economies to global capital markets, which can have over time, I think, quite an untold impact. So that was really important for me. But more importantly, it was really because that team is made up of members from a number of treaty parties and indeed non-treaty parties from across the Pacific, and working in a team where Australians are in the minority in the Pacific, from Melanesia, Polynesia, and Micronesia is just the most fun, rewarding experience and great team to be part of. So yeah, I'll give a bit of a shout out to the PASA Plus implementation unit, who are still doing amazing work, and such an excellent team to work in.
Fantastic. And no, even though I'm not a legal practitioner, I've never practiced, I have done fieldwork studying what international law does. And during my MPhil, when I was doing some of that fieldwork, I got detained in an African airport under armed guard on suspicions of espionage for about 12 hours till they could confirm that I was actually an academic. So that was definitely an experience, having a bunch of airport security with weapons going through my underwear in front of me, wondering if I was engaging in espionage. So just because we're sharing stories, I figured I'd throw that one out there because it's just wild. All right, so we are coming to the end of our time, so I'm going to ask some wrap-up questions of our guests, and I'll ask both of them, and then you can answer both before throwing over to someone else. And so what we have is, what recommendations do you have for anyone who'd like to know anything more about what we discussed today? And what is your current escape route? So what are you doing or reading or watching that take your mind off international law and get some of that really important decompression time? And I think this time I will start with CJ.
Thanks, Tamsin. I think for those who are interested in either starting their career in international law or making a switch into international law from policy or from another area of practice, there are so many opportunities out there. I think ANZL is an excellent forum that you can invest time in to build connections. And join a bunch of very passionate practitioners. For those interested in practice, kind of like offered by the Office of International Law, the Attorney General's Department has entry-level roles and mid-level roles that offer a lot of particularly those generalist skills and a lot of exposure across legal policy and practice. And my escape route at the moment is playing bridge. I took up playing bridge last year, and I may have gone a little bit too deep so far. Most people only associate bridge with a scene out of an Austen novel, but I'm fascinated to tell you that it is alive and well in Canberra, and we've just played a big competition over January where my wife and I and my teammates managed to win the national level under 300 Master Point trophy. So by complete surprise. And what I love about bridge, particularly perhaps for you, Sarah, needs a bit of quiet time. At the bridge table, you can't fit anything else in your head. There's so much going on that I find if I come home and I've had a really tough day, sometimes I get asked, do you want to skip bridge? Absolutely not, because it's one of the only activities I can do where I cannot fit another thought in my brain, and you're just really focused on what's going on at the table.
I think that's just amazing, because as you know, I actually represented ACT in the Grand National Open Teams one year in bridge. So I haven't been playing much recently because I haven't had time to find a bridge partner with all of the various things that have been going on since I moved away to Canberra and then moved back. But I am here for the bridge.
I'm so pleased to say that my wife and I also repped the ACT in the Grand National Open Teams last year. So I'm so pleased to be your successor, one of your successors in that.
Yes, my partner and I, our team got knocked out fairly early, but we ended up 8th in the pairs division in the year we were there. So, all right, Dave, I'm going to pass it on to you for this one.
Okay, I'll just make sure I unmute. So recommendations, I think take the opportunities that come your way, which is a very unhelpful statement, I suppose. But if you try and map out a particular path in international law, you're likely to be disappointed and surprised because you're really not sure where it's going to take you. If somebody said to me 25 years ago that I was going to be an academic at ANU and University of Wollongong, I would not have thought that was in the realms of possibility for where I was going to be. So, and don't be upset if things don't, if you have plans and think this is the trajectory you would like to go on and it doesn't work out that way, what I found out is that opportunities that do come your way, including meeting people, don't underestimate the importance of meeting people through organisations as CJ and you and Sarah have all mentioned with ANZL. There's also the Australian branch of the International Law Association, and various other, Sarah mentioned about going to conferences, various other opportunities where you can meet people who might be working on issues that you're interested in, and that could, a casual conversation could lead you down some way that you weren't expecting to go. So I think having those contacts, that they've certainly helped me throughout my career, various contacts, both when I was working as a military lawyer and also in academia, and they've led to various visits, publications, people coming to Australia and so on. So that's very important. Escape route, well, we've already discussed that, Tamsin. It's a bit of a problem that we both got. Sarah and I also happen to live rather close to each other, so I do enjoy meeting her and her husband occasionally and their dog with my dog, or dogs. In fact, that's how I knew Sarah wasn't all that well. I saw her husband the other day who said, "Don't come near her. She's not particularly well at the moment." But just doing things like that, I've recently become a grandfather. So I'm now officially old, well over the age of 60, got a senior's card and a grandson. So all of those things are important as well in terms of, shutting down or shutting out a little bit of some of the workload associated with being an international lawyer.
Fantastic. Thanks for that insight, Dave. And Sarah, do you want to wrap us up here?
Thanks, Tamsin. And I think I'm now going to have to learn bridge. I've never played before, but CJ, you might have to teach me, please. So look, in addition to all the terrific suggestions and recommendations that CJ and Dave have provided, just a couple of additional thoughts from me are, I absolutely will agree with the importance of becoming part of one or more international law societies and associations. Obviously, we have ANZL, but in addition, the Asian Society of International Law, the European Society, the American Society, British Institute of International Comparative Law, and the International Law Association. And obviously, one doesn't have time to be actively involved in all those activities, but at least signing up to their newsletters and seeing their publications, I think, helps to give one, notice of interesting opportunities and conferences and so on. So I think casting one's gaze a little wider can be really valuable. Another thing I would say is for people to recognize that there are really now multiple pathways in international law. Things have changed so much even over the 22 years or so that I have been practicing. There are so many more opportunities now than there used to be. And I think it's important for people to be aware that there's no one right pathway. There are many different pathways. And as we've all said throughout the course of today's discussion, opportunities can really arise unexpectedly. So I think it's important to be open to change and open to feeling a bit uncomfortable as one's making a transition into new roles. Because I think in the course of one's international law career, one doesn't have to just be one thing. There'll often be different chapters of one's practice where your identities and affiliations and areas of expertise will evolve. In terms of things that really take my mind off international law, well, for me, a few things. Rejuvenating downtime usually involves some escapism through reading novels or watching movies with my kids. So 2 boys of 8 and 11, movie afternoons or movie nights on the couch, always with popcorn. Also, I love music and always find that music is very helpful in changing my mood and taking my mind off work. So my husband and I are enjoying introducing our kids to the music of the 60s, 70s, 80s and 90s. Particularly, I find a good way to start a day is blasting music on the way to school drop-off and having the whole car belting out songs. So that is a great way to start the day and end the day. And one last thing is some good downtime for me is cooking with the kids. And we've started a practice of trying where we can to cook on Sunday afternoons, a few additional meals for us to eat as a family throughout the week to try to ease the pressure of busy weeknights. There's a lot of taste testing. It ends up looking like a disaster in the kitchen, but it's good fun. And I usually find that the Sarah of a Tuesday or Wednesday night, who's just home from a long day of work with the whole family tired and hangry, always looks back and thanks Sunday afternoon Sarah for doing that big cooking session. So those are just a few ways that I escape a little bit from work.
Thank you all so much. That is all we have time for. So I'd like to, again, thank all of you for coming on and talking about your careers and what practice of international law looks like. And to our listeners, I hope you've enjoyed the episode. Bye-bye.